Eccoci online, buongiorno a tutte e a tutti. Come l'altra volta inizio a parlare in italiano giusto per salutarvi, e per ringraziare chi ci sta seguendo, chi si sta collegando in questo momento. Siamo arrivati alla seconda preview online che anticipa l'evento in presenza, gli EV Pro Days 2024, che si terranno a Trieste l'1 e il 2 novembre, per cui vi ricordo, a chi volesse partecipare in presenza, questo è il link per vedere il programma completo e per registrarsi, quindi per registrarsi e partecipare in presenza all'evento. Tra l'altro vi ricordo che l'evento è completamente gratuito, per cui basta registrarsi, giusto per una comodità, ecco, però l'evento è del tutto gratuito, quindi vi invito a partecipare a Trieste alla 2 giorni degli EV Pro Days. Però io direi che passo subito la parola a Daniele e a Federica di Arcadia Café, che anche oggi sono qui con noi, e li ringrazio perché ci aiutano anche in queste preview online con la loro moderazione. E saluto Remy Siu, l'autore del gioco di cui parleremo oggi, ma lascio la parola a Daniele e Federica, così passiamo all'inglese e Remy ci può capire. Ecco. Quindi grazie ancora.
Okay. Hi everyone. We are Daniele and Federica from Arcadia Café, and today we'll be speaking about how creative processes can be chaotic, can be messy, but can tell wonderful stories and convey wonderful messages. And they can do this in the best way possible and in the weirdest ways possible. We are here with Remy to speak about all these topics.
Remy's team had experiences with many forms of art, and they choose to make a video game to talk about important themes, historical themes, autobiographic themes. It's 1000xRESIST. It's a very dense game, and today Remy will tell us about the creative process of this game.
Yes, so we'll leave the floor to Remy to start the lecture, and we hope you enjoy it. Hi, Remy. Welcome to this talk, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Okay, so thank you for joining us. I'm going to be talking about creative process, diaspora, and sci-fi in 1000xRESIST. And this talk is going to be structured a little bit more like an artist talk, where I will cover a little bit about myself, my practice in the performing arts, and how that relates to my own diasporic lived experience, as well as with my peers. And then I will talk about kind of how all of that stuff led to making 1000xRESIST and some of the processes that we used to make 1000xRESIST. So my name is Remy Siu. I'm the creative director and narrative designer at Sunset Visitor Studios. And I founded the studio in 2021. And before that, for 10 years, I worked in the experimental performing arts. And I trained actually as a composer, a new music composer for concert. And then I also studied electroacoustic music and tape music during that time. And after school, I really got interested and started working with theater and dance performers. So I would be switching to be working with live electronics, doing and improvising electronics real time with the performers on stage. And that eventually extended to also controlling lights, real-time lights, and projectors as well. And so I was able to kind of improvise, or my desire was to improvise an entire mise en scène. And from there, that's kind of also how I got into real-time 3D through a framework called Touch Designer, and that led to also using Unity. And so it was about that time when I kind of got to be comfortable with that technology. So I felt like I could maybe even begin possibly making a video game of any kind. And so even though that was a kind of desire of mine early on, kind of growing up. So to kind of start talking about my performing arts practice, I always start with locality because I think it's really important, the environment that artists kind of emerge out of or are either growing up in and are affected by. And so for me, I'm based out of Vancouver, Canada, which is on the west coast of Canada. And I would say the practice that eventually I had come to undertake was one that was very specifically Vancouver and Pacific Northwest. And I say this because Vancouver had a long tradition of fluxus and conceptual artwork. And we also had very weak artistic institutions. And I don't say that as a kind of judgment value. I say that they were just much smaller and didn't permeate the culture as strongly as, say, other places, even, for example, like Montreal or Toronto in Canada. So we had weak music conservatories. We didn't have very strong large theaters, and we didn't have very many dance academies. And so that kind of created a lot of space for artists in Vancouver to do a kind of lots of radical artistic experimentation. And so what would actually come to define the output of Vancouver arts is very much these artist-run galleries and centers and nonprofit companies. And here's a picture of one called the Western Front, someplace that I would go to a lot as a kind of young artist. And here they would have a room for experimental dance. Upstairs, they had a room for experimental music. And then also they had a visual art gallery where they were doing all kinds of different things. And because of the lack of large institutions and not a lot of resources in Vancouver for the arts, there became a lot of intermingling between dance, theater, and music, just based on proximity and us needing each other to survive. Because Vancouver is not an easy city for artists to survive in. And I think a lot of artists do leave. And for people who stayed, like myself, we really had to focus on local relationships and finding a way to work together, often across disciplines. And we did this. One of the methods we used, our primary method we used to do this, was through something we call devised processes, or either that could be devised theater or devised dance. And these processes are kind of collective creation, and there's no pre-existing blueprint when we begin a work. There's no script or no score for that work. And when we do it, we often do it with an ensemble with people from different disciplinary backgrounds. That could be music, dance, theater, whatever. But it could also be people from backgrounds that were not trained in the arts. And so it could be a plumber, or it could be an architect. I shouldn't say the architect. I very much consider inside the arts, but you kind of get what I mean. It's to kind of get all these people together in a room and try to make something, try to make a performance. And in that kind of process, we would foreground the improvisatory and the emergent. And so as things began to emerge, as we would be working together in our improvisations, and then also through kind of task-based assignments, we would try to grab onto what was becoming inside of the room, as opposed to say we had a final result already in mind. Additionally, I would say that these device processes really prioritized a what you see is what you get environment. And we did this because we always wanted to have every element that would be on stage to already be present while we were making the work and rehearsing the work. This is unlike traditional theater, where you would maybe rehearse with the script, with the actors in kind of a room, And then eventually you would take it into the theater, and then you would do your lighting, and then you would do your set, and you would do all of that stuff. We wanted it straight from the beginning because we wanted to be experimenting with it all of the time, so we could be close to what we were making and see what we were making and react to it as we were making it. So the way that I practiced this was very much in a multidisciplinary context. And here are some pictures of the work that I made previous to starting the studio. I had founded a performing arts company called Hong Kong Exile, and it was made up of myself and 2 other co-founders. And the 3 of us, we kind of had different specialties in either music, dance, theater, or new media, which was either software or creative coding. And we often explored, sorry, excuse me. Give me a second to drink some water. It's a little bit later here. We would often kind of get together to explore how our disciplines worked and creative processes for that. So very early on in our practice, we failed at that a lot. We tried to stack all of these together, and we found that we weren't really getting anywhere. We were trying to have all of these processes be additive onto one another, and we weren't getting along, and we were having a difficult time. And so over time, sorry, I'm just going to cough. Give me 1 second. Excuse me, sorry. So over time, we discovered that we actually had to undertake a kind of subtractive process where each discipline had to die a little death for us to be able to make the work together. And that meant that all of our priorities, whether it was as a choreographer or as a composer or as a theater practitioner, it had to take a back seat, and we had to look at what we needed to focus on to kind of create the work that we wanted to make, because we realized that we couldn't all fit in the same space together. We had to kind of make space for each other. So we would kind of get to a situation where we would take these little pieces off our own practice and of ourselves and our training, and we would try to fit them into a configuration. And once we did that, we realized there was a kind of missing space always, kind of lack space, what I'll call it. And this was a space where we could be generative and take all the kind of combinations and configurations that we had made for a particular piece and extend into this space to explore unknowns. And in this case, I would say to push the limits of the priorities of that work to the max. So while we were doing this, simultaneously in our kind of own lived experience, the 3 of us were of different diasporic backgrounds. We were also kind of trying to discover and understand ourselves and how we related to the different cultures that we belonged to. And so we realized that we were actually actively doing this for ourselves as well, while we were doing it from a more formal disciplinary place in our practice. And so as we kind of stumbled about trying to form some degree of identity between multiple cultures, we also realized that, hey, there was a degree of lack space in this as well, and a kind of impossible space to fill, that as we were trying to put the pieces that made sense to us together, there was something missing. And so I really think what we started to do was to fill that space with a degree of imagination. And that's also where it started to put us in this liminal space where we are kind of in between all of our different homes, whether it's our kind of home that we were born into, our found home, our ancestral home, or our motherland. We were bopping back and forth between these places, kind of not really understanding where we could be or where we could go, and none of it always 100% made sense to us. Simultaneously, while this was happening, we were realizing this was happening to us in our professional art making lives as well, where the things that we were making, these strange configurations, where we had extended out into this extra space, was having a difficult time being presented at more traditional venues. Either it's a music festival or a theater festival or new media festival. It was not always 100% the right place to present something. And so we were also stuck in this kind of liminal space, being very nomadic, kind of presenting in a new media festival here, doing a theater festival here. So we found ourselves kind of lost in this in-between space. But that's kind of when we started to really think about how speculative fiction and kind of projecting forward into the future would be helpful for us, whether that was in our own kind of understandings of our identity through our kind of diasporic lived experiences, or also whether that was kind of how we would try to make sense of our own work that we were making as we were making it. So here's an example of a work that we had made before working or founding the company. It's called Foxconn Frequency Number 3, and it's for 3 visibly Chinese performers. And it's a work where 3 pianists who are trained are inputting and doing tasks that are given to them from a software hardware apparatus that we made for the work. And they're doing that in real time. And most importantly, the actions that they take on the keyboard are not actually actions that you hear. So unlike in a normal piano performance, their input is fed through the software and then results in a different kind of sound completely. They're also tasked by the software to perform these tasks, and they're judged on the adequacy in which they perform these tasks. And that kind of defined the flow of the work and the structure of the work. You can kind of see in the background, this information is displayed to the audience so they can see at any given time what or how the performers are doing. And so with this work, what we really did was subtracted very much of the musician's agency or musician's kind of, how would I say, the musician's interest in their own output in sound, and focused on what type of work could we make if we decoupled the resulting action, the action that a musician made and the resulting sound that they outputted from their instrument. And from this kind of very simple thought, we were able to kind of create a hardware software apparatus that allowed us to explore new thematic materials that addressed kind of mass manufacturing and addressed kind of labor in China, piano pedagogy, but then also projecting those into a kind of weird future as they synthesized as the piece progressed. Another example of a work that we were doing at the time was a stage work where we essentially took actors and decided that they would not be able to use their bodies in a traditional way on stage, but instead we gave them cameras in miniatures and also created this kind of long video wall in which the actors became operators. And so they would become operators and cinematographers and find different ways to exercise their training and to express themselves on stage to kind of tell a story that was very impossible to stage if we were doing it traditionally, which involved kind of traversing a strange interdimensional mall of some kind. So that was largely what I was doing before the pandemic. And so, of course, when the pandemic hit, all of these practices largely grounded to a halt. And we had to kind of sit down and say that, okay, if we can't practice, what do we do now? And so we had decided to kind of turn our attention to video games, which was something that at least I was very interested in since I was young. And so that's very much what we did. It tried to bring a lot of what I talked about into the process of making a video game. And so our first game is called 1000xRESIST. And it's a sci-fi narrative game. And I'm just going to play a trailer so that everybody can kind of get a sense of what it is if you don't know about it.
Tell me, Watcher, is there a feeling worth getting incinerated over?
Love your mother and trust in her teachings. Do your duties and carry out your function for a future far from sin or incineration. We're all just flowers in a garden of her making. Soon we'll grow beautiful enough to be worth taking. The All-Mother, she shines so bright, but Mother's glow is not as warm as it had seemed to be, and it feels very far from me, and it feels very far from me.
Yeah. So a very quick overview of 1000xRESIST is that it's a narrative adventure game with no fail states, very light puzzles, extremely story forward in the genres of science fiction and magical realism, and it employs multiple perspectives and control schemes. So like first person, third person, top down, side scrolling, and we use those to explore themes of generational trauma and the Hong Kong diaspora. So this is, again, something, when we started the project, we really actively subtracted from it as much as possible, very much kind of carrying on what I had talked about in the past. We were trying to take away parts that we would be considered necessary for a game, like combat or items or any of this stuff, and try to kind of whittle it down to something that was very... minimalist is the wrong word for it, but really to focus and allow us to play with narrative. And so this is where we really wanted to push our priorities and to tell a narrative with as little ludonarrative dissonance as possible. And so we wanted to take the idea of being able to focus completely on one story across multiple time periods and push that as far as we can. And we had the space to do that only because we subtracted as many mechanics as possible to make space for that. And I think this kind of hyper-focused goal resulted in something that I think other people largely would not do, only because they would not have made the subtractions that we did, because we really, at least in our past experience, we knew that if we didn't make those subtractions, we wouldn't have the necessary space to kind of tell the story at the scope that we wanted to tell it. And so we kind of did this in a process which we called the devised writer's room, which was a little bit of a synthesis of what I've talked about up until this point, and a kind of TV's writer's room. And so a TV writer's room is usually when a bunch of writers pitch to each other and kind of come up with outlines for an episode, and then they go write a script. We kind of took that process and we mutated it to whatever ended up working out for us. And so in this room, it was very similar to our kind of performing arts devised rooms. In this case, we had no experience writing for games, and there were 3 writers. But each of the 3 writers had different disciplinary backgrounds. And so for myself, I was music and new media. We had another person from dance and poetry background, and a person who was a theater practitioner and director. One thing we did have was 10 years worth of experience kind of making work together. So in this case, we started with our themes first. And this is something that we would always do in our performing arts works, because when we had no script or no score, often we would only really be able to focus on what we called our curiosities, I guess, our thematics. And so we would arrange them, spend a lot of time kind of thinking about how they would connect and how we wanted the mood to be, or how we wanted to assemble them in proximity with each other. And then we would spend even more time trying to understand as much about those themes as possible and how they could manifest in the kind of fictional world that we were thinking about. And after we've done that for quite a long time, in our case, I believe it was at least maybe a month or 2 months of just doing this, we would start to beat out a chronology or a kind of linear structure of how we think the game should unfold, or what events unfold in the game. So a funny note about this chronology is that it's completely out of date, because after we do all of this, we throw it out. We really try to take the value of devised process to embrace the unknown and the emergent. And we also know from experience that the first time we make an intervention in an artwork, in this case, a written word, it really changes everything. And we wanted to, if the first word is going to change something, we want to understand and recognize what is becoming emergent because of it. And so the game is made up of 10 chapters. And in each chapter, we went through a process of pitching all of these ideas that we might have about what a chapter or episode of it should be. And then we would proceed into a phase which we called the hot drafts, which is very similar to something we would do in a devised performing arts room, where we would be given tasks to a certain extent stemmed from the pitches, and writers would go off and write however they feel they wanted to respond to that task. In the case of the performing arts, they would go off into a different room and maybe rehearse and improvise something and then present it to the everybody in the room. And that's what we would do after hot drafts. We would just write and write and write and write and write as much as we can about anything that interests us. And then we would read them all together and then start to build connections between the work that we were making, even though they may not end up in the game. And then we would start to cut ones that weren't interesting to us and follow ones that were, and then rewrite them for implementation in the Unity game engine. And after we implemented them, we would rewrite them some more. And then eventually, when we were comfortable enough, we would go voice record the lines, and we would rewrite them again if we wanted to, sometimes improvising with the actor in the booth, because they had taken a direction that was surprising to us and we wanted to follow it. And so we would do this one chapter at a time. So the game was really kind of made out in a linear fashion. And so we would complete an entire chapter of the game before we would go and work on the next one, or begin kind of writing the next one. And so essentially we made kind of 10 small games for 1000xRESIST as a whole game. And the reason why we did this is because we strongly believed that we wanted to allow the work to inform itself as it was developing. And I think it also goes back to what I said in devised processes. We really prioritize a what you see is what you get environment. And again, one of the reasons we did that is because as writers and as creators, we want to be able to look at a thing kind of in a good state or near completion and really assess what it's doing to us, what it's doing to other people, before kind of deciding what to do next, before deciding what next choices we should make. And so this kind of one chapter at a time sequential writing process, I think, was really important and kind of why the game turned out the way it did. Because every time we did it, it felt like we were learning more. We were being able to fold and listen to our own writing and make connections that I think we wouldn't otherwise have made if we didn't do it in such a way. So kind of 1000, this, kind of similar to some of the little diagrams I had made before, 1000xRESIST really exists in this kind of liminal space between all these different game genres. But I think, its lack space was when we took out so much of the mechanics that we would consider necessary for a game and really just to focus on the story, was we were able to really kind of delve into cinematography and cameras and the way that the story itself would unfold with the very limited mechanics that we had. And so that kind of lack space here is really, I think, what defines the game and kind of the way that I can communicate many of the things that it wants to do. I would say, additionally, that as we did this, one of the constraints and subtractions we had to make was that we had to make sure it was feasible for us to do. And so, I truly believe that science fiction thrives under constraints, and especially in a TV context. If you kind of go back and think of a classic example, the 1960s Star Trek, the reason and the world building for a transporter and the reason why we have it was out of a production concern that they didn't want to land a shuttle on a planet every week. So they invented the transporter to make that more feasible and, frankly, just cheaper to be able to depict. And so for us, we kind of made a concession and constraint that we wanted to reuse a lot of standing sets in our the way that we would tell the stories. And so we see this actually happening in a lot of 90s television science fiction, where these standing sets reoccur every episode, but they themselves kind of become their own little motifs and take on a degree of meaning that can only be kind of gained through repetition. And so this was something artistically we wanted to lean on, but it was 100% born out of a constraint created by a harsh subtraction where we wanted to focus so much on the narrative. By doing this, we would be able to achieve a flexibility in our storytelling and the way that we would try to achieve it in a way that would allow us to be extremely ruthless, I think. And I hopefully, for people who have played the game, you can maybe sense that degree of ruthlessness as you move through the game, with all of its kind of different twists and turns. So this is kind of what I've been calling our creation stack or process stack, if it were a tech stack. We had kind of come to understand that multidisciplinary practice requires subtraction for us to be able to make space for each other. We also kind of understood that our diasporic desire was to imagine futures, because being in this liminal space between homes, maybe the home that we kind of desired or we're looking for had yet to exist. And so we needed to kind of project forward for it. And additionally, as I said, science fiction really thrives under constraints. And so it's a kind of order of operation here where, the subtraction allows us ways to depict imagined futures in kind of new and interesting formal ways. And then from that kind of creates a constraint on the science fiction world building that we are trying to explore. And from there, we have to create invention to handle that constraint. So, why? One question I always ask myself is like, why do I keep doing this, or why do we keep doing this? We get pianists to play, but you can't hear them. You get actors and make them into camera people. And in this case, we're making a video game where we subtract so much out of it from the mechanical place that some people sometimes accuse us that they don't think it's a video game. Why do we think this is important? I think it comes down to the fact that I really feel that there are so many discoveries left to be made in the margins, and especially with video games, and additionally with sometimes performing arts, being market-driven industries, we always look for what is additive, what are kind of new features. But I think a lot kind of gets lost along the way in terms of artistic discovery and formal tools that we've yet to really kind of unearth for the medium, because we move at that pace, or because we have those priorities. And I think if we just look back, and even looking at our contemporaneous tools that we have as video game makers, there's so much just left to be discovered, so much left on the table artistically, formally, that we could explore if we make those subtractions, both from a kind of disciplinary, formal, or content way. So yeah, that's my very broad overview of kind of our processes about making 1000xRESIST and kind of what led us there. Sorry for my voice kind of giving out as I was doing it, but yeah, thank you. I'm open for questions.
That was very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. We were mesmerized, can I say that? Because of all the process of creating such things. Because coming from the video game side, it is very likely to hear such comments like a video game is not a video game if it doesn't have a 1000 mechanics and things that it's not like they distract you from the main goal. I mean, they can be used in a very insightful way, but it does not always happen. So why would you put all of that stuff if they don't tell anything? So yes, I think this is a great way of creating something. That's my comment.
Yes. If the chat has comments, questions,
yes,
we
you
will
can
read.
write them down and we will read it. So
Meanwhile, we have some
A question.
questions ourselves. In the inspiration for the game, you quoted Yoko Taro. Yoko Taro also has made various performances of his works.
Yes.
Do you wish to bring your work, your story, your themes in other medias?
Okay.
Oh.
I think
Credo sia accaduto, ma lo aspettiamo.
esatto.
Questo è il
magari-
è il bello della diretta, quindi magari la connessione è caduta nel
Avete più
frattempo.
tempo per scrivere domande, vedo che stanno
Esatto.
uscendo cose
Esatto.
belle,
Esatto.
picciose
Quindi,
intanto.
anche
Sì,
perché
magari
Remy sa che...
ripetiamo perché comunque è un attimo crashato.
Sì, no, ma comunque tra l'altro adesso appena torna, una cosa interessante che vorrei dirgli, quando ha detto che molti giocatori l'hanno criticato perché non è un videogioco.
È un
È
classico.
un po' quello che è accaduto
Gliel'ho
con
detto,
i...
un classico.
Sì, cioè mi ha molto colpito perché è un po' quello che è accaduto con i walking simulator, se ci pensate, per
Sì,
cui...
Proprio
Tra
il
l'altro
genere è
era
nato.
tra i pezzi da mettere insieme per il pezzo mancante della creazione, quindi
So
Eccoci,
sorry.
here we are.
Back.
Don't worry.
That was good timing though, because it was at the end of the talk. It immediately disconnected.
Don't worry, it's not a problem.
Did
I think Andrea...
did you listen to the Daniele and Federica question?
Sorry, I missed it. Sorry, could you
Okay.
ask
Okay,
again?
we can repeat, but I think Andrea wants to tell you something first.
Yeah.
Since he's here, like...
When you said that a lot of players told you that this is not a video game because it's not full of mechanics and other things, but it's something that happened with the walking simulator genre when it first came to light with the Arrester, and then What Remains of Edith Finch. Everybody's gone to the Rapture, but to be honest, I think they are really masterpieces. So, and I also think your game, as I told you before the live, I think it's one of the best game of this year. So I don't understand why people need video games to be so traditional, and they why people can't experience something new sometimes, even from the team perspective, because your game is full of different teams. And so that it's not a question, it's more my opinion about your game. So that's okay. So if Daniele and Federica,
we can repeat the whole thing, because I just want to say something about this thing before, because I'll forget it, I'm sure. It's like being in a room where there's a button that if pushed will do things, and on one hand you can not push the button, let someone else do it, and things will happen. And on the other hand, you push the button and make the things happen. You just do one thing, one simple thing, doing the button push, and the same thing happens. But the agency you have in the first case is very different. So it doesn't make sense to say it's not a video game. Anyway, back to the question, because, okay.
My question was about the inspiration and from Yoko Taro. Yoko Taro is also a creator that experienced multiple form of arts and brought his works in performances. Do you wish in the future to bring your work in other media?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of things that we did in the performing arts that sometimes I think about bringing over to games. I haven't 100% decided whether we should take any of those older works and kind of adapt them into games. I think our biggest thing is just to kind of continue at the core employing, or kind of continue practicing the way that we've had. What's interesting though, that after we've made this game, like, we learned a lot. And so it's like now, like, this practice has inherited things that we learned from making video games, and some of that is video game things themselves. And so I don't know how it will look like in the future, because like it keeps mutating some of these processes as we learn more and more things about how to even say bridge some of the performing arts into games. Now, having that a little bit experience under our belt, how do we take that and then turn it and mutate it into also something new? So that's something we're thinking about a lot, and we don't really have an answer for. But I think it's also important always to look at other mediums and other work in other mediums. That's just naturally something that we do, because we just obsessed about experiencing anything that we can, I guess. And so
you can learn and bring it back, then bring back.
Yes.
There can be communication.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, I think there are some questions in the chat. Okay. First of all, a comment. I believe 1000xRESIST was one of the most interesting video games in 2024. So, yes, I agree.
Thank you so much.
Then it covers all of us. Okay. So Stefano loved 1000xRESIST and how it deals with topics like transgenerational trauma, ontology, and stuff like that. I have a question concerning the role memory plays in the game, which is, of course, a rather pivotal one. Memory is the key of how regimes are built. or mother kind of builds a role regime, I don't know how to say that, upon shared memories, and at the same time it's key in how certain political structure are subverted. In the end, the game seems to suggest that somehow memory must teach us to forget, at least if I'm getting it. But what does this mean for diaspora children nowadays? Very interesting question.
Yeah, it's an interesting and complex question. May you back up to the first part of the question real quick? I just wanted to. And then the next one. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really complicated question. I don't know exactly, if I have like a very straight answer for this. And and I think that's also kind of reflected in the game in the sense that we often kind of set out to explore so many of these angles because we don't 100% know the answers to them. And I don't know if we always come to say a conclusion or the artwork itself would come to a conclusion. But like in the game, as you were mentioning, so much of memory sometimes can be used to oppress. Memory can sometimes be used to manifest as tradition, and tradition can be used to oppress. And then in many ways, also memory can be destroyed and cut off in many kinds of political events in the past. There has been like a huge erasure of the past, and that was very dangerous, and that kind of cuts a line off and a tie off to memory. And as a person kind of in the diaspora, that's something that we're always worried about, because I mean, we're always worried about are we the last, are we the thing that breaks the link? Are we like how are we going to, and much of this is continually always reflected in the end of the game as well. It's like, how are we how do we kind of respect the things that we have, that we've inherited, and how do we carry it forward? And again, like one of the reasons why the game is the way it is at the end is that we don't 100% know. And that's something we continue to kind of navigate. And I'm sure many immigrants in diaspora continue to navigate kind of day to day how we treat the memories of the things that we have, whether they're positive or negative. Because many of the things, and this is something we kind of obsessed about during the game, making the game, is that many of the negative memories or trauma that one has experienced in the past slowly morphs into culture. And then that culture becomes something that maybe is important, right? And how do you grapple with that? Like, that culture may not always become toxic. That culture may just become culture, and in some ways about how you may, in ways that you may eat with other people, or ways that you may greet other people, or all of these things were things that we were always obsessing about while we were making the game. So I 100% don't know. This is classic. I 100% don't know if I answered your question, but I feel like in the game we just try to explore that angle of memory in as many ways as possible with the time that we had, very much with the concerns that, when does bad memories become culture, becomes important, but then also when does cutting off memory also become culture, and then becomes like it's again, there's no answer to it. It's just only like kind of points in space which we're always kind of orbiting.
Yes,
so I'm sorry if I didn't 100% answer your question.
I was ending that yes, memories can be culture, but also forgetting can be culture, because tradition sometimes it's sometimes about selecting some of the memories while letting some other memories away. So
memories can also forge you.
Yes.
So if you keep bad memories,
they will forge you too. Yes. It's not always for the bad side. I mean, even bad memories can be part of you and can build positive culture. I mean, it's a complicated stuff. Well,
we have another question. The game is imbued with references to Neon Genesis Evangelion. Is there a political, ideological reason behind this? Or are the references to Evangelion within the game only concerning aesthetics?
Yeah, that's another good question. I would say that we didn't look at Evangelion really 100% from a kind of political or ideological angle, especially at least kind of looking at it as a reference or making references to it. I think a large part of what attracted us to Evangelion, especially the TV series, was the rhythm of how many things played out in that series. And so, spoilers for anybody who hasn't watched, I guess, like much of the first half of the series is kind of a procedural, like an angel per episode or something like this. And that was kind of a structure that we were following for in the first half of the game. And then, of course, the second half of the TV series, it really goes off the rails. And so structurally, that was something that always interested me. And additionally, just moment-to-moment rhythms in the episodes themselves and the filmmaking of them themselves were something that really attracted us. And then finally, I think the production of Evangelion, the TV show, I think is quite storied at this point. But and nothing like that happened to us really. But one thing that we often would talk about is that Anno felt very artistically desperate. I think especially near the end. To a certain extent, that's kind of how he, one of the reasons maybe why those last two episodes, or the last episode of the TV series of Evangelion is the way that it is because it famously ran out of money and they needed to air it, and they were just trying to find ways to depict it or make it work, and it became this huge new generative object that is, I guess, controversial, but I think it's a wild object, right, of circumstance. And often one of the things that we would say in the writer's room is that, we want to write ourselves into a place where we are desperate, where we really don't know the answers and we really don't know how to, what to do next. And if we got to that place, if our solution, if we could solve it, there would be an energy that comes with the solving of it that would I think the audience would feel. And so I think that was one of the big values throughout the game. So I mean, those are many of the ways that I think we kind of were influenced by Evangelion, beyond just say the imagery and some of the aesthetics.
It makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think you answered the question, the previous question you, Stefano says, yes, you surely have answered the question. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And again, great game. Stefano is a huge fan of yours. So
thanks, Stefano.
And no more questions from the public, so I think it's time to say goodbye to Remy. And first of all, thank you, Remy, for accepting our invitation. And if you should come to Italy, let us know.
Yes, absolutely.
We can meet in the future in person. So thank you again, and thank you, Daniele and Federica, for being our moderators today. And I'm switching to Italian right now. Vi ricordo vi rimetto il link per vedere il programma completo degli Evi Pro Days, per registrarvi all'evento. Vi ricordo appunto che è necessario registrarsi gratuitamente, ma bisogna registrarsi per partecipare a Trieste l'1 e il 2 novembre, quindi vi aspettiamo. Ci saranno molte altre lecture, molti ospiti, per cui niente, ci saremo. Ci saranno anche Daniele e Federica, per cui ecco. Ci vedremo anche di persona. Ecco. So thank you, Remy, and good night, because I think it's time to go to bed.
It's pretty late, yeah.
I might try and walk out for one of these 24-hour ramen.
Wow.
Walk
Wild.
around. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Remy. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.